All right, let's jump right into it. In this explainer, we're unpacking a really incredible piece of history, how the Soviet Union completely lost their seemingly insurmountable lead in the space race. It's a fascinating look at how an absolute superpower can just lose its grip on dominance, not because of a lack of talent, but because of some really critical institutional choices.
So, you gotta wonder, right? How exactly did they go from total dominance to a completely devastating defeat? Well, the answer lies in a classic tale of a rushed sprint versus a methodical marathon. As we're going to see today, losing their power in space had way less to do with engineering and literally everything to do with philosophy, politics, and, honestly, pacing. Let's start with Phase 1, the early Soviet lead, where they were basically sprinting right out of the gate.
Just look at the sheer volume of these early Soviet firsts. They were absolutely the hare in this race. First satellite, first animal, first man, first woman, first spacewalk, the whole shebang. To the rest of the world, and especially to folks back in the US, it felt like the Soviets were playing a completely different game. They weren't just winning, they were leaving the Americans in the dust.
Now, a huge reason for this was their massive early technological advantage. It was all thanks to this brilliant engineer, Sergey Korolev, and his absolute behemoth of a rocket, the R-7. This thing was initially built as a long-range ballistic missile intended for nuclear weapons. It was a total monster. We're talking 5 rocket engines, 5 fuel tanks, and 20 nozzles. Meanwhile, early American rockets, they were literally struggling to launch something the size of a grapefruit without it just exploding right there on the pad. The sheer brute force of the R-7 gave the Soviets an incredible head start.
But to understand why it all fell apart, we need to look at the root of the problem, prioritizing propaganda over safety.
And that brings us directly to Nikita Khrushchev. He was obsessed with how the world perceived communism, and he basically turned space exploration into this rushed propaganda machine. He figured out pretty quickly that launching rockets was the perfect way to make the entire globe stop and recognize Soviet power. Not just through military threats, but through this awe-inspiring technological supremacy.
But here's the catch. Arbitrary political deadlines, like, say, the anniversary of the October Revolution, completely superseded basic engineering safety. This wasn't a scientific exploration program anymore, it was a political tool. The directive from the top was clear: do it at any cost. That meant rushing hardware, skipping crucial tests, and setting launch dates based on holidays instead of actual engineering realities.
So the core difference here is stark. While the US was methodically taking one small step at a time, like the tortoise, the highly secretive Soviet program was dangerously rushing to hit the next big milestone. Sure, the Americans had their fair share of very public failures, but their pace was slower, their rockets started small, and they actively worked to recover their animal test subjects alive. The Soviets, our hare in this scenario, operated under intense secrecy, accepting massive risks just to maintain this illusion of an effortless lead.
Which leads us to a really dark chapter. What actually happens when that ambition turns fatal?
Well, the tragic story of Laika the dog shows us right off the bat that the Soviets were willing to completely disregard life. They rushed a mission that, honestly, provided very little useful scientific data. Chief Engineer Korolev was given just 4 weeks to pull off a spectacular launch for that 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. Because of that impossible deadline, they had zero time to invent a way to bring Laika back safely. They launched her knowing full well she wouldn't survive, and tragically, she died of overheating just a few orbits in.
And behind the Iron Curtain, it was hidden chaos. Even their greatest triumphs were plagued by untested hardware and crazy near-fatal errors. The world only saw the victories, right? But Soviet secrecy hid the reality. For example, to meet a deadline in 1960, a prototype rocket was rushed, exploded on the pad, and killed 54 people in what's known as the Netherland catastrophe. Even Yuri Gagarin's famous flight had a massive secret. He actually had to eject at 7 kilometers high because the capsule's return speed would have killed him. Or take Alexei Leonov's first spacewalk. His untested suit expanded so much in the vacuum of space, he almost couldn't get back inside the airlock. When he finally did, a re-entry glitch caused them to land deep in a Siberian forest, literally surrounded by wolves.
Years later, Leonov himself confirmed that their entire program was operating constantly on the ragged edge of disaster. I mean, almost no plan was ever thought out all the way to the end. They'd figure out how to launch, and then essentially just cross their fingers for the trip back.
This obsession with optics reached its darkest point in 1967. After the brilliant Sergey Korolev died, the program lost its main visionary. Next up was the new Soyuz spacecraft, which was supposed to eventually take cosmonauts to the moon, but it just wasn't ready. Engineers explicitly reported over 200 design faults.
Over 200! But politicians ignored the warnings because they wanted a big PR win for Lenin's birthday. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was forced to launch, fully aware he was stepping into what was essentially a death trap.
And the result was absolutely disastrous. Komarov's fatal crash proved exactly why skipping testing is a terrible idea. From the moment he reached orbit, systems just started failing one by one. Solar panels wouldn't unfold, power dropped, stabilization died. By some absolute miracle, he managed to manually align the craft for re-entry, only for the untested parachutes to completely fail. It was a completely avoidable tragedy, born purely out of a gamble for political prestige.
Now, let's flip the script and look at the American approach, our methodical tortoise.
When President Kennedy promised to land a man on the moon, the U.S. had exactly 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. 15! Alan Shepard had literally just gone up and come right back down. So committing to a lunar landing within a decade seemed absolutely impossible, especially considering how far ahead the Soviets were at that exact moment. Now, NASA faced its own heartbreaking tragedy with the Apollo 1 fire during a routine ground test, which took the lives of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. But unlike the Soviets, NASA reacted by halting everything. They didn't sweep it under the rug and launch the next crew a month later to meet some arbitrary deadline. No, they grounded the entire program. They completely redesigned the capsule, changed the oxygen mix, and invented a new quick-release hatch. They actively chose to delay their timeline to ensure they actually understood the engineering.
Instead of rushing, NASA utilized a highly specialized, carefully calculated modular approach to slowly master orbital mechanics. They broke this impossible moon problem down into smaller, testable pieces. Across 16 crewed missions in Project Mercury and Gemini, they practiced spacewalks, docking, navigating. They tested the command module by itself, then the lunar module by itself in Earth's orbit. Then they flew all the way to the moon without even landing on Apollo 8 and 10. Every single piece was verified before they made that final attempt.
Which brings us to the final showdown, the rocket race to the moon.
To actually reach the moon, you need unprecedented power. The Soviets' monstrous 30-engine N-1 rocket was going head-to-head against America's meticulously tested Saturn V. The Americans used 5 massive, rigorously tested F-1 engines for their first stage. The Soviets, well, they lacked the time and tech to build engines that large, so they decided to just strap 30 smaller engines together. But they were in such a frantic hurry, they never even tested the entire first stage together on a test stand before attempting a real launch.
And that habit of launching untested hardware, it finally caught up with them in spectacular fashion. In February 1969, the first N-1 flew for barely a minute before cascading failures brought it down. Incredibly, they just tried again a few months later, in July. This second rocket lost its engines almost immediately upon launch, falling straight back down onto the pad completely full of fuel. The resulting blast was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. It completely wiped out their launch pad and effectively vaporized their chances of getting to the moon first.
Just weeks after that massive Soviet explosion, America's steady step-by-step approach won the ultimate prize. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface. While the Soviet program was quite literally in ashes from taking far too many shortcuts, NASA was reaping the rewards of patience, testing, and a willingness to learn from failure rather than hide it.
So, the big takeaway here is the stark difference between calculated engineering and reckless political gambling. The Soviets didn't lose their power on the global stage because they lacked brilliant minds. They lost because their leadership treated a monumental engineering challenge like a PR campaign. They consistently prioritized arbitrary dates and optics over human lives and foundational science.
In the end, this whole space race was the ultimate tortoise and hare story. The rushed, secretive hare lost to the methodical tortoise. And it really leaves us to wonder, where else in history or even in our own lives has reckless ambition cost us the ultimate victory? It just goes to show that true technological power isn't built on rushing for the optics. It's built on a foundation of patience, rigorous testing, and an unwavering commitment to getting the details right.